Thank you for tuning in to the Chai Academy, being broadcast from the Chai Center. Today's class is entitled Kiddush Hashem, Martyrdom. Kiddush Hashem literally means sanctification of God's name. So we'll talk. There's actually a couple of meanings, of a couple of definitions of sanctification of God's name. The first one we'll discuss is martyrdom. So here's the general principle: is that there are 613 laws in the Torah. 613. At any time, except for 3, you are allowed to violate them if your life is at risk. So, one example would be the doctor says you have to take this medication, and it's on Passover, but yet it contains grain, and it's chametz, and it's forbidden, or it's not kosher. It's it's a shark or whatever. Hey, Eileen, good afternoon. So you are allowed to take the medication. If it's not life-threatening, then it all depends what the story is. It means pain, etc. But if it's life-threatening, if you in fact decline, it's unacceptable behavior, right? If it's life-threatening and the thing you're doing is life-saving, then you have to do it. You have no choice. And in fact, you should be happy. You should feel like the high priest lighting the menorah in the Holy Temple, happy, because you're doing the right thing. You're saving your life. Likewise, if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, "Eat this ham sandwich," so your response, or I'll shoot you. Your response is, "Do you have any mustard, or can you warm it up?" Right? You don't have to say, "Well, take my life, I'm not eating this ham sandwich. Take my life, I'm not eating this lobster tail," or et cetera, et cetera. So you have to live for the Torah and not die by it. However, there's three separate mitzvahs in the Torah that you have to die. And basically, because if you do them, it changes your whole morality. It changes the very fabric of who you are. So, murder. If somebody says, "We need you to kill somebody, or you'll be killed," you have to say, "I'm not going to do it." Likewise, if they surround your town and they say, "Give us 5 able-bodied men so we can kill them, and the rest you can keep," you have to defend those men, even if you don't know them by name, even if you haven't decided who you're going to give up. Likewise, if they see, there's a siege around the town, they say, "Give us your pretty maiden," or and if you give us your pretty maiden, we will not attack your town. You have to say, "No, we're going to defend our pretty maidens to the last drop of blood." Somebody says, I'm lovesick. If I don't lay with this woman, I'm going to die. So you tell them, die. Right? You don't give up your morality. You don't give up your soul. You don't kill anybody. You don't give anybody up for sex. Rather die. Rather die. The last one is what generally is spoken about, Kiddush Hashem, is sanctification of God's name. This would be specifically, you are asked to give up your Jewishness. Deny your Jewishness. Deny God. Embrace another religion. Give a speech that, to the masses because you're influential, that you don't believe in God, and it's okay not to believe in God. It's okay to embrace this, that, the other. You have to die for it. Even if in your heart, secretly in your heart, you say, oh, this is nonsense. And I think the most common example would be the in the Spanish Inquisition, right? You had until a certain date in 1492 to either get out, convert, or be killed. A lot got out. A lot didn't, because they felt it was futile anyway. They get out to Portugal, they're coming into Portugal. They get out to Italy, they're coming to Italy. So they didn't get out, and they refused. They refused to accept, embrace this forced Christianity upon them by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and they chose death rather than convert. Right? And they were burnt on the order de fe. They were burnt, publicly burnt. There were others during the Spanish Inquisition who said, you know what? I'm going to save my life. I need to live long enough in order for Queen Isabella to die. And if I live long enough, I can be a Jew back again. So there were those enusim, those that were coerced to adopt a faith other than their own. And in the Spanish language, they didn't call them anusim. Anusim means the coerced. They called them marranos. Marranos means pigs. That here they are showing how loyal they are to the church, but in reality, deep in their basement, you'll see that they kept Judaism. They lit the Shabbat candles. They put on tefillin. They kept kosher, etc. So the outward world, they were Christians, but internally, they were good Jews. So you can't do that. May we never be faced with anything like that. Of course, I feel terrible. I mean, that they actually had to choose that. So they were considered the anusim, those that were coerced, and compassion on them. It's not, you can't condemn them unless you put you step into their shoes. Is it right? No, it was wrong. It was absolutely wrong. And by the way, you go into Spain today. I was in Toledo, and you go to Toledo, which is an ancient Jewish quarter, and there's shops. Every shop sells the same thing. Every single shop, they sell this Jewish goods, which is not. They claim it's from back in the day, pre-Inquisition, but the reality is that it's not. It's just not. But what's fascinating, if you know somebody there, they'll take you to the downstairs, the cellars, the bunkers. In these bunkers, which are huge, that is where these anusim used to hide. Now, a person who was an anus, they were coerced, that's not called sanctification of God's name. The person who was killed publicly, privately, they were considered to have died for the sanctification of God's name. According to the Tanya, according to the book in the Kabbalah, you cannot get higher than that. There's no lofty, your soul can't ascend any higher. The fact that you're willing to sacrifice everything and die and not embrace a religion, a faith that's not your own, it's the loftiest level. And it happened a lot in Spain. It happened a lot under the Romans. It happened a lot under the Nazis, where people would not deny their Jewishness. They were stopped in the street and they said, "Are you Jewish?" They say yes. Mind-boggling. Once again, their shoes are huge. How do you, how do you even, I can't even wrap my mind around it, let alone. So that is considered the sanctification of God's name. The sanctification of God's name publicly, and the sanctification of God's name privately. Publicly is considered loftier than private, where people know and you're summarily executed because you were a Jew. So, one could argue Leo Frank was killed because he was a Jew. Right? Google him. We actually gave a class on him. The only American to really be lynched because he was Jewish. But in the former Soviet Union, I can't tell you how many Jews died or were sent to Siberia and died there. So it wasn't a direct firing squad, but it was indirect death because they refused to give up their Jewishness. They were told, the communist government said you cannot study Torah, and they did. You cannot teach children Torah. You have to close the schools, and they didn't. You cannot have matzah on Passover. You cannot circumcise your child. They defied it. They defied it at the very cost. And there are literally thousands of Jews, and tens of thousands of Jews, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews, who died than rather embrace communism and atheism and basically turn their back on Judaism. Right? The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe and his father, so Rabbi Shalom Schneerson, Rabbi Joseph Schneerson, the Rebbe, Rabbi Mendel Schneerson, they all defied these communists, and they were all on the run or imprisoned, and political sway and clout got them out, but Rabbi Joseph Schneerson was sentenced to death. Eventually, it was commuted, and he didn't die. He wasn't killed, but hundreds of thousands. I mean, people. I know people whose grandparents died, or whose great-grandparents literally died in the gulags, right? Because they were Jewish. Can't get loftier than that. And by the way, anybody that helps somebody is also died for the sanctification of God's name, because they risked their lives, right? The most famous is Oskar Schindler. Risked his life. He could have been killed, but he didn't. He risked his life, and that was our Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name, and on and so forth. Now, I will tell you, there's a great story, a phenomenal story, that took place probably close to 300 years ago, and it took place in Vilna, right? So Vilna is the place where the Vilna Gaon came from. Vilna was under the rule of the Tsarist government and then the communist government, but this took place in Vilna close to 300 years ago, where there was this prominent Gentile. He was prominent. Not only was he prominent, he was called Count. So, I don't know much about counts. The only count I really know is in Sesame Street, right? Count Dracula. But he was a count. Extremely wealthy, extremely influential, etc. And his name was, I wrote it down, Count Valentin Potok. And he converted to Judaism. And he converted to Judaism on which was, if you converted back then to Judaism, it was punishable by death and the order to fay, a public burning. But he was the count. He was a huge person. So he was, friends and family came to him and they said, if you just convert back, we can get your death penalty overturned. Don't do this. Why die at such a young age and such a horrible death when you can live your whole life, terrible insomnia. When you can live your whole life you can live. To which he said, I refuse. They said, you're being an idiot. And they put tremendous pressure on him. And they said, why wouldn't you consider it? It's not as if the religion negates God. It may negate the one God, right? But it doesn't negate God at all. So why would you give up your life? To which he said, it's parallel. He gave a metaphor, and he said that this is it's very, very similar to a person that loses a bag of pennies, nickels, and is searching for them. And he comes across this town, and he finds gold coins. But he's told that you can keep those gold coins as long as you stay in the city limits. If you leave the city limits, you will have to give up your wealth. So he said to himself, I'm no longer going to look for those pennies and nickels because I found gold coins. So he said to his friends and his family, I found truth. Why would I go back to something that's I don't resonate with? It's not truth to me. Why would I do that? And he was actually burnt at the stake, and he was killed. Now, back then, he was considered the holiest martyr, Count, right? Count Valentin, incredible martyr, just amazing what he did. And there was a fellow by the name of Eli Ziskus who pretended, because then they blocked off the area where he was burned because they didn't want it to become a place where the martyrs died, and it was only open to Christians. So Eli Ziskus pretended he was a Christian. He managed to get to the place, and he picked up the ashes. He also found a finger or two, and he brought it back to the Jewish quarter in Vilna, and he buried it, and it became a holy place, a place where actually they used to say Kiddush every year on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of Av, and on the high holy days. That was considered a holy place because it was this count. If anybody knows what a count is, tell me. Where this count died for the sanctification of God's name. So that is one level of Kiddush Hashem, where you die at the sanctification of God's name. More colloquially, we don't really have that so much in the United States, where I'm going to die, right? So if the government came out with a decree, let's talk about it. The government came out with a decree, and the government said, like they did in Denmark, I believe, no more slaughter, no more ritual slaughter, right? Kosher slaughter is unacceptable. You have to either eat meat that was killed by a bullet or import it. So what they do is they actually import it. But what if they said you can't import it? And so you say, okay, I can have no meat. But what if they went a step further? You have to buy meat and chicken that's treif, right? So earlier we said you don't have to give up your life, right? But that was an isolated incident. But if the government said you have to eat meat, then you would either fake it, you either get meat imported clandestinely and show the government you're eating meat, They have no idea it's kosher. Or you would say, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. You can incarcerate me. I'm not going to do it. I refuse to eat meat. You know, in Belgium, they tried to ban circumcision. And as you know, for a Jewish person, it's a bond. It's a fabric of who we are. So it didn't pass. But what would you do? What would you do? So what you would probably do is you would do it like they did in Russia. Do it clandestinely. Do it, no fanfare. You would have a mohel who's on the cutting edge, who would do it in the middle of the night in a basement. That's what you would do. You can't just give up on this. You would have to defy them. And if the penalty for defying them is jail, so be it. If you're caught, you go to jail. Right? So we don't have this in the United States. By the way, in San Francisco, they did try and abolish circumcision. They did. They failed. But what if it was passed? Okay, so you say, I won't go to San Francisco, I'll go to Marin County. So we don't do circumcisions. Or you can say, I'm not going to be held like this. I'm not. God, in this respect, God comes first. So I'm sure there are at first many Jews would go to Marin County, but others would say this is unacceptable behavior and I'm going to go to jail. You kind of be like the Rosa Parks of circumcision. I'm not listening to this. This is un-American. And on and on and on. I was very annoyed when this fellow by the name of Aaron Kayak, I think his name is. So he's the White House. He's a Jewish liaison to the White House. And a few months ago, he came out with an op-ed that said that it's time for Jews, because of the anti-Semitism in the United States, it's time for Jews to not wear a kippah or cover their kippah. Don't wear the yarmulke, wear a hat, wear a cap. To me, that was probably one of the darkest days in our recent history. It's a lot worse than many, many things, because this is coming from the Jewish liaison to the White House, who yes, he's a private citizen. He's not a civil servant. He's not paid by the White House. But he answers to the White House. And he could say such a thing. To me, this is a slippery slope into don't do this and don't do this and don't do this. And I wrote an op-ed, which was not published by the same paper, that said defy him. Wear that yarmulke. And if you're a non-Jew, wear that yarmulke. Because how dare he? This is all about Kiddush Hashem. This is sanctification of God's name. And this is the reason, by the way, to sanctify God's name. You'll find, Eileen, the only way to stop anti-Semitism is to be a proud Jew. A non-Jew respects a Jew that respects themselves. That's a given. That's proven. But this is the reason why you have in Williamsburg and Borough Park and Crown Heights, the Hasidim wear their garb. Because they said, you know what, we wore this garb in Russia, where we were punished for being a Jew. We're not going to stop now. We're not going to stop now. We're not going to say, okay, because we came to America, let's wear a Xenia suit. Has to be clean, by the way. If you see somebody wearing a chassid wearing something dirty, it's unacceptable. It has to be clean. You can't have stains, you can't have BO, etc., etc. That there's no excuse for. But to wear and dress the way you want and act the way you want is pride and is Kiddush Hashem. And you may say, oh, come on, Kiddush Hashem, they look at the way they dress. Look, the long things and the payas. And so my response is, it's Kiddush Hashem. It's sanctification of God's name. If it was Amish, you would say, wow, look, that's their tradition. So if you respect the Amish, you have to respect the Hasidim, because they're doing it for the same reasons. This is their traditional garb, and they are proud of whom they are, their heritage, no different than you find anybody who respects the heritage. No different than a priest or a nun who feel that they represent God. They too also feel they represent God. So there's no difference. Absolutely no difference. The difference is they're not Christian, they're Jewish. The difference is they're not the Amish are Mennonite, something like that, Mennonite. The Amish are Mennonite, and these are Hasidic Jews. That's the only difference. Right? And that's all part and parcel of Kiddush Hashem. Kiddush Hashem is where you sanctify God's name, and you don't shy away or embarrassed that you're God, that you represent God, that you study God's Torah, do God's mitzvahs, Jew or Gentile for that matter. Right? That's the first definition of Kiddush Hashem. You're proud of whom you are, and you will stop for nobody. And if a government tells you you can't do this, you have to fight the government tooth and nail. Tooth and nail. Now, there are times where you should not fight the government tooth and nail. So, by the original lockdown, right, they said you can no longer congregate. You can no longer daven in a shul. So this was for health reasons. So the government gets a pass. But if the government said we no longer can congregate in shul because all Jewish houses of worship are closed, then we have to say, we have to say absolutely not. We have to say get lost, jump in the lake, go to hell. We are not listening to you, and we're not bowing to the tyranny. And I think that's why people were so angry at Governor Cuomo. At first, everybody got it, but then he started to make exceptions. Okay, this is essential. This is not essential. So he was arbitrary, and that's why people started to disobey him, because they felt that hair salons were okay in New York, but they weren't. It's not okay in New York to daven, and they felt he was practicing a Mengele move with his thumb. This is essential. I decree this is essential, and I decree this is not essential. So yeah, he's the former governor, and that's probably the part and parcel of the reason why he's no longer governor. But because it was tyranny coming from the highest person in the state, and that's why people defied it, the governor. But in the beginning, the first 3 months, nobody would think of defying it, and if they did defy it, they were wrong. We didn't know how deadly COVID is, and it proved to be very deadly. So this is the first definition of Kiddush Hashem. In tomorrow's class, we're going to talk about the second definition, the more common definition of Kiddush Hashem. So tune in tomorrow. Please feel free to share, invite friends and family, and I bid you farewell.